My friends, I want to tell you about a conversation I had with a therapist in my early 70s, a conversation that permanently changed how I understood a painful relationship I had spent decades trying to explain away through kinder, gentler interpretations. I had been describing, in considerable detail, a family member whose behavior had confused and wounded me for years, someone who seemed genuinely warm and loving one moment, and then, without any clear provocation, coldly manipulative and calculating the next. I spent most of that session offering my own generous theories, that this person had simply never learned better communication, that some unresolved childhood wound explained the behavior, that if I could just find the right words, the right patience, the right approach, this person would finally stop hurting me the way they had for years. The therapist listened patiently to all of this, and then she said something that landed on me with a coldness I have never forgotten. She told me, gently but directly, that I needed to consider a possibility I had spent years actively avoiding. This person likely knew exactly what they were doing. Not confused. Not unaware. Not simply lacking better tools. Genuinely, consciously aware, at some real level, of the effect their words and actions had on me, and choosing to use this awareness anyway, because it reliably produced the outcome they wanted. I want to be honest with you that I resisted this idea fiercely at first. It felt, in that moment, considerably crueler than any of the gentler explanations I had spent years constructing for myself. But over the following months, examining this particular relationship honestly through this new, uncomfortable lens, I began recognizing a pattern I had never permitted myself to see clearly before, a pattern that, once seen, could not be unseen, and that ultimately explained years of confusion I had never managed to resolve through any of my earlier, kinder theories. I want to say plainly, before we go further, that I understand why this particular truth carries the word cold in its very title. It is genuinely uncomfortable to consider that someone we love, or once loved, might be acting with a level of conscious awareness we have spent years unwilling to attribute to them. Most of us are raised to believe that generosity of interpretation reflects goodness of character, and there is real truth in this belief within the great majority of our relationships. But I have come to believe that this same generous instinct, applied indiscriminately and without regard to actual, accumulating evidence, can become a genuine liability in the specific, narrower category of relationships where a pattern of conscious manipulation is actually present, leaving us defenseless precisely because our own goodness keeps insisting on an innocence the evidence itself no longer genuinely supports. Today I want to share with you this one cold truth, and the many places across my own experience where I eventually watched it prove itself accurate, again and again, in ways that finally offered me the clarity that years of generous, well-intentioned misunderstanding never had. The one cold truth underlying everything I am about to share is this: manipulators are not confused, broken, or simply lacking better tools. The great majority of them know precisely what they are doing, and they choose their targets deliberately, selecting people whose genuine virtues, empathy, conscientiousness, a deep aversion to conflict, make them considerably easier to manipulate than people who lack these particular qualities. For most of my life, I believed that manipulation reflected some unfortunate, unconscious pattern the manipulator themselves did not fully understand or control. I finally understood, through considerable painful examination, that this generous assumption, however kindly intended, was very often simply incorrect, and that recognizing this cold truth clearly, rather than continuing to search for a gentle explanation, was the beginning of genuine protection I had never managed to access through years of patient, generous misunderstanding. Everything that follows is simply this one truth, appearing across the many different corners of my own experience where it eventually proved itself accurate. The first place this truth revealed itself was in noticing that this particular family member's manipulative behavior occurred almost exclusively in private, one-on-one settings, and almost never in front of witnesses whose presence might have exposed the pattern or complicated its effectiveness. I recognized, examining this honestly, that a genuinely confused or unaware person would likely behave with reasonable consistency regardless of who happened to be present. The careful, consistent selectivity of when this particular manipulation occurred, always in settings where it could operate without outside observation or challenge, revealed a level of calculation that confusion alone could never adequately explain. The second place this truth revealed itself was in noticing that this same family member consistently adjusted their particular manipulative approach based on what had and had not worked previously with me specifically, refining their tactics over time the way anyone genuinely skilled at a particular pursuit gradually refines their technique through experience. I recalled, examining several years of this pattern honestly, that guilt-based appeals, once I had grown somewhat more resistant to them, were gradually replaced with different tactics, subtle flattery, feigned vulnerability, each new approach introduced only once the previous one had begun losing its effectiveness, a pattern of genuine adaptation that unconscious, confused behavior does not typically display with this degree of responsive sophistication. The third place this truth revealed itself was in noticing that this family member's manipulative behavior toward me differed considerably from how they treated people whose approval or resources they had no particular reason to want, exactly the pattern I discussed in an earlier reflection regarding red flags kind people tend to ignore. This differential treatment, calibrated so precisely according to what each particular relationship could offer, revealed a level of strategic awareness that a genuinely confused or unconscious pattern would be unlikely to display with such consistent, self-serving precision. The fourth place this truth revealed itself was in noticing that this family member never once employed these particular manipulative tactics against people known for firm, immediate boundaries, reserving this behavior almost exclusively for people, myself very much included, known for patience, conflict avoidance, and a general reluctance to confront difficult behavior directly. This selective targeting, avoiding people whose temperament would likely produce swift, unwelcome pushback while consistently choosing people whose temperament made prolonged tolerance considerably more likely, revealed a genuine strategic calculation about which particular targets would allow this behavior to continue most effectively and for the longest possible duration. The fifth place this truth revealed itself was in noticing that this family member's apparent remorse, whenever their manipulation was finally, directly confronted, reliably lasted only as long as necessary to restore the relationship stability, after which the underlying pattern would resume, often within a matter of weeks. A genuinely confused, unconscious pattern, once directly named and understood by the person exhibiting it, would typically show some genuine, lasting effort toward change. The reliable, cyclical return of this particular pattern following each temporary period of apparent remorse suggested something considerably more calculated than confusion, a strategic recognition that sufficient temporary contrition would restore access to a relationship that the underlying manipulation itself had never genuinely been intended to abandon. The sixth place this truth revealed itself was in recognizing that this family member displayed genuine sophistication and awareness in nearly every other domain of their own life: professional negotiations, financial planning, social positioning, and sophistication entirely inconsistent with the genuine confusion or unawareness that would need to explain their behavior specifically within our relationship. I recognize that a person capable of considerable strategic sophistication in nearly every other area of their life was unlikely to suddenly, selectively lose the same capacity for awareness specifically within the one particular relationship where this awareness happened to be most inconvenient to acknowledge. The seventh place this truth revealed itself was in noticing how quickly and precisely this family member could identify and articulate my own particular emotional vulnerabilities during unrelated conversations, a level of accurate, detailed understanding entirely inconsistent with any genuine confusion about how their own behavior was actually landing and affecting me. A person genuinely unaware of my emotional experience would be unlikely to demonstrate this same precise, detailed understanding of my particular sensitivities during other, unrelated conversations, an understanding that revealed considerable ongoing attention to exactly how I experience things, attention that made the claimed unawareness regarding their own manipulative behavior considerably less credible upon honest examination. The eighth place this truth revealed itself was in recognizing my own repeated pattern of offering increasingly generous, elaborate explanations for behavior that, examined without this generous interpretive lens, was actually quite straightforward and consistent. I recognized that my own considerable effort to construct kinder, more forgiving explanations for this pattern reflected less about the actual complexity of what was happening and more about my own genuine reluctance to accept the considerably simpler, colder explanation that this therapist had eventually offered me directly. The ninth place this truth revealed itself was in recognizing that accepting this colder explanation, however initially painful, ultimately produced considerably more genuine peace than my years of gentler, more generous misunderstanding ever had. Once I finally accepted that this particular pattern reflected genuine, conscious choice rather than confused unawareness, I discovered I could finally respond with appropriate, clear boundaries rather than continuing to search for the perfect combination of patience and understanding that might somehow eventually produce a change that, I now understood, had never genuinely depended on my own approach in the first place. The 10th place this truth revealed itself was in observing similar patterns in several other relationships across my own broader community, patterns other friends had also spent years explaining away through similarly generous, patient interpretations that this same colder truth eventually clarified for them as well. Several friends, once I shared this particular reframing, recognized immediately similar patterns in their own difficult relationships, patterns of careful, adaptive, selectively targeted behavior that a genuine, unconscious confusion could never adequately explain, patterns that, once recognized clearly for the conscious, strategic behavior they actually represented, finally allowed these friends to respond with the same appropriate clarity I had eventually developed myself. The 11th place this truth revealed itself was in recognizing that continued generous interpretation of this pattern had actually been serving the manipulator's own interests considerably more than it had ever served the relationship's genuine health, since my continued patient forgiveness had, in effect, been rewarding exactly the behavior I most wanted to see stop. I came to understand that my own generous misunderstanding, however kindly intended, had functioned as a genuine incentive for this pattern to continue, removing any meaningful cost or consequence for behavior that, once I finally recognized its conscious, strategic nature, I began addressing with considerably more appropriate firmness. The 12th place this truth revealed itself was in recognizing that my own guilt about accepting this colder, less generous interpretation reflected an old, deeply held belief that assuming the best about others represented a moral obligation regardless of the actual evidence available. I came to understand that continuing to assume unconscious confusion in the face of consistent, adaptive, selectively targeted evidence to the contrary was not, in fact, a genuine moral virtue, but rather a form of willful self-deception that ultimately served neither my own genuine well-being nor, I eventually came to believe, any genuine possibility of this family member ever developing real accountability for a pattern they had never been required to fully own. The 13th place this truth revealed itself was in noticing that this family member consistently avoided any written record of the specific claims and appeals they made during moments of manipulation, preferring phone calls and private conversations over texts or emails whenever the stakes of a particular request were genuinely significant. I recognized, once I paid honest attention to this pattern, that a person confused about their own behavior would have little particular reason to avoid written records of it, while a person consciously aware that a given request or claim might not withstand later scrutiny would have every reason to prefer the deniability that only unrecorded, private conversation genuinely provides. The 14th place this truth revealed itself was in observing that this pattern intensified noticeably during periods when this family member had a specific, identifiable need, financial, emotional, or logistical, and softened considerably during periods when no such particular need existed. This correlation, considerably more precise and consistent than genuine unconscious confusion would typically produce, revealed a pattern responsive to actual circumstance and genuine need rather than some fixed, unconscious personality trait operating independently of any particular strategic advantage it happened to offer at a given moment. The 15th place this truth revealed itself was in recognizing that this family member displayed genuine skill at identifying precisely which appeals would be most effective with each different person in their life, using guilt with one relative, flattery with another, feigned crisis with a third, each carefully calibrated to the particular vulnerabilities of the specific person being approached. This differentiated, person-specific calibration, requiring genuine ongoing attention to each individual relationship's particular emotional landscape, reflected a level of interpersonal awareness entirely inconsistent with the general confusion or unawareness that would need to explain an unconscious, uncalculated pattern. The 16th place this truth revealed itself was in my own eventual recognition that directly, calmly naming this pattern aloud to the manipulator, without anger but also without my old habitual generous reinterpretation, produced a noticeably different reaction than any confusion-based explanation could account for, a brief, telling flicker of something closer to caught awareness rather than genuine surprise or bewilderment. This particular reaction, subtle but unmistakable once I finally knew to look for it, offered perhaps the most direct evidence available that beneath the practiced innocence lay a genuine, conscious awareness that had simply never before been named quite so plainly and directly. And the 17th and final form this one cold truth takes, the one that ties every other form together, is simply this: you are not chosen as a target because of any weakness or failing on your own part. You are chosen precisely because of your genuine virtues, your empathy, your patience, your conscientiousness, qualities a manipulator recognizes and calculates will make their particular tactics considerably more effective. And understanding this clearly transforms the entire experience. From a source of self-doubt into a source of genuine, if painful, clarity. For years, I quietly wondered what particular weakness in my own character had made me such a consistent target for this pattern. I finally understood, through considerable difficult reflection, that the qualities that had made me an effective target were not weaknesses at all, but genuine virtues, virtues a conscious, strategic manipulator had simply learned to recognize and exploit, a recognition that finally allowed me to hold my own character with considerably more compassion than the years of quiet self-doubt this pattern had previously produced in me. My friends, I want to be honest with you that accepting this particular cold truth was one of the more difficult psychological shifts of my entire later life, considerably more difficult than any of the gentler lessons I have shared with you in our previous conversations together. It required me to release a belief I had held since childhood, that assuming the best about people always represented the more virtuous, more loving choice, regardless of the actual evidence in front of me. I have come to believe, through considerable painful experience, that this belief, however well-intentioned, can actually leave us considerably more vulnerable to exactly the kind of conscious, calculated manipulation that a colder, more honest assessment would help us recognize and address considerably sooner. I think often of that particular therapy session, and how genuinely unsettling her words felt to me in that moment, and how genuinely clarifying they ultimately became once I allowed myself to actually sit with them rather than immediately retreating back into my old, more comfortable, more generous interpretations. I do not believe accepting this cold truth requires becoming cynical or suspicious of everyone in your life. The great majority of the people I love and trust have never once displayed this particular pattern of conscious, calculated manipulation, and I continue to extend genuine, generous trust to these relationships without any hesitation whatsoever. What this cold truth requires, rather, is a willingness to recognize the specific, consistent evidence of conscious calculation when it genuinely does appear, rather than continuing to explain this evidence away through generous theories that the actual, consistent pattern simply does not support. I want to offer one further reflection that I believe is genuinely important before we close. Distinguishing between genuine confusion and conscious manipulation is not always simple, and I do not want to suggest that every difficult or hurtful behavior in your own life necessarily reflects deliberate calculation. Genuine confusion, genuine unresolved wounds, and genuine unconscious patterns absolutely do exist, and applying this cold truth indiscriminately to every difficult relationship in your life would be its own kind of error, replacing one form of unhelpful generalization with another. What I am describing today applies specifically to the particular pattern of consistent, adaptive, selectively targeted behavior I have outlined across these many examples, a pattern that, once genuinely present across multiple consistent instances, deserves this colder, more honest consideration rather than continued, indefinite generous reinterpretation. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in a difficult relationship of your own, this same pattern of adaptive, selectively targeted behavior that you have spent years explaining away through kinder, gentler interpretations, I want you to gently consider whether this particular therapist's colder truth might apply to your own situation as well. This recognition, however painful in the moment, may ultimately offer you considerably more genuine clarity and protection than years of continued, generous misunderstanding ever could. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize, with appropriate clarity rather than continued generous confusion, any pattern in your own life that this particular cold truth might help explain. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Continue extending genuine trust and generosity to the people who have genuinely earned it, but remain honestly, clearly alert to the specific evidence that distinguishes genuine confusion from conscious, calculated manipulation, evidence that, once recognized clearly, offers a protection that generous misunderstanding alone can never quite provide. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay discerning, stay honest, and remember, you are not targeted for your weakness. You are targeted for your virtue, and recognizing this clearly is the beginning of protecting it. Thank you for watching.